It was the summer of 2008 when I found myself in the Grand Canyon. I'd been planning the trip for months with a group of friends, and we were excited. We'd already spent a few days backpacking through the harsh, dry terrain, down to the bottom where the Colorado River cut its way through the ancient stone. The heat was oppressive during the day, but the nights were cool, and we'd set up camp near the river, away from the crowds that tended to gather around the more popular spots. I remember looking up at the sky that evening, the stars so bright and clear it felt like the whole universe was staring back at me. The sound of the river was constant, like a low hum in the distance, but soothing. We were all sitting around the campfire, talking about the hike, cracking jokes, and making plans for the rest of the trip. None of us had any idea that this peaceful night was about to turn into a nightmare. The air shifted suddenly, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. A cold wind whipped through the canyon, ruffling the tents. One of the guys, Jason, thought he heard thunder off in the distance, but we all brushed it off. There hadn't been any rain for weeks, and the weather forecast didn't call for anything drastic. It was just an echo, we thought. We were wrong. Sometime around midnight, the first drops of rain started to fall. At first, it was light, almost like a soft drizzle, but within minutes, it started coming down in sheets. Then the ground began to tremble. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the wind picked up, howling down the canyon walls like a freight train. The storm wasn't just a typical monsoon. It was something else entirely. It was as if the canyon had come alive, roaring and shaking as though it were about to swallow us whole. I stood up, my heart pounding, looking out at the blackness of the canyon. Felt like the river itself was swelling. It wasn't a gradual rise either. The water was coming fast, surging from the Colorado River and cutting through the camp. I could hear it now, the violent rush of water, like a freight train barreling down on us. People screamed in panic. The night was filled with chaos, the sound of shuffling feet, desperate shouts, and the crashing of trees being pulled from their roots by the rising flood. "Get up the cliff, now!" someone shouted, and that's when I realized we weren't just facing a flash flood. We were fighting for our lives. I didn't think, I just ran. We were in a shallow part of the canyon, the cliffs rising steeply on either side, and the water was quickly rising, swamping the ground around us. I saw the others scrambling to get to higher ground, climbing the cliff walls like ants. The fear in the air was palpable. The water was a deep, muddy brown, and it moved like a beast, swallowing everything in its path. I made it to a higher ledge, scrambling up the rocky wall, my hands raw from gripping the sharp edges of the stone. Below me, the floodwaters surged and churned, picking up boulders and debris, tossing them around like they were nothing. I looked down at the camp, now submerged, tents and gear floating away like useless toys. I wasn't alone. Others had made it to the same ledge, and we huddled together, clinging to the rock as the storm raged on. But there was no time to feel relieved. The worst was still ahead. I could hear screams coming from further downstream. There were people who hadn't made it up the cliff fast enough. The flood was merciless. I saw two figures, a man and a woman, caught in the surge, desperately trying to swim toward the rocks. The man didn't make it. I watched in horror as he was swept away, his arms flailing for a second before he was swallowed by the current. The woman, though, managed to grab hold of a tree branch that had somehow managed to stay anchored in the water. But the branch wasn't enough. The current was too strong. It was only a matter of time before the flood would tear her away as well. Then, something caught my eye, and my heart nearly stopped. A woman was climbing toward us, but she wasn't alone. She had a baby strapped to her back. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing at first. How could she be moving so calmly, so deliberately, in the midst of all this chaos? But there she was, focused and determined, her body swaying with every step as she moved across a rope that was strung across the river. The rope was meant for crossing the river, but it was only a few feet above the water, and the current was fierce. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat as I watched her move. The woman wasn't just climbing the rope. She was moving against the rushing torrent, her body pulled by the flood, yet she held on tight. With the baby secured on her back, she gritted her teeth, inching toward the boulder on the other side. Behind her, the water roared as massive trees and debris were tossed down, crashing into the rope and pulling it tighter, threatening to break it under the pressure. I don't know how she kept her balance, but she did. The rope creaked and groaned under the weight, and every now and then, a massive wave would crash up against her, threatening to pull her under. The water was moving so fast, so violently, that it looked like the very earth itself was being torn apart. But she didn't stop. She kept moving, her legs trembling with each step as the baby, somehow still asleep, remained strapped to her back. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I couldn't look away. I saw others around me, equally transfixed, all of us knowing how close she was to death, how little chance she had of making it across. The force of the flood was unbearable. There was no way she would be able to hold on, but somehow she did. It took what felt like hours, but finally, with a last, desperate pull, the woman reached the boulder. She didn't collapse. She didn't falter. She climbed onto the rock, her body shaking violently from the effort, but she was alive. She had made it. I'm not sure how long I stood there, staring at her. Time lost all meaning in that moment. The storm finally started to let up, the rain slowing to a drizzle, and the water began to recede. We still had no way of knowing how many had made it out, but we were all just relieved that we had. We were alive, but it wasn't over yet. It took hours for the flood to recede enough for us to make our way down the cliffs and into the valley below. The damage was catastrophic. The path we had taken on our hike was washed out. There were fallen trees everywhere, debris scattered in every direction. The camp was gone, swallowed by the floodwaters. But we were alive, and that's what mattered. The woman with the baby, she made it. We saw her in the aftermath, shaking but alive, her baby in her arms. She was covered in mud and water, but she had done what seemed impossible. She had saved herself and her child against all odds. The flood would go down in history as one of the worst the Grand Canyon had ever seen. It claimed lives, it destroyed everything in its path, but it also proved the strength and resilience of those who fought against it. We made it out of there, too, some of us carrying scars, some of us carrying memories. But we all had one thing in common. We were lucky to be alive. And when I look back on that night, I'll always remember the sight of that woman, crossing that river with her baby on her back, against all odds. It was the closest thing to a miracle I've ever seen. A few years ago, my wife and her friends decided to take a quick detour while driving out to Hood River, Oregon. It was one of those brutally hot weekends when the heat radiates off the asphalt, and the air feels thick, like it's suffocating you. They had heard about a spot called Punchbowl Falls, a popular swimming hole not too far off the beaten path. The plan was simple. Park the car, take a quick hike in flip-flops and swimsuits, cool off in the water, and be back on the road in no time. The trail was just over a mile long, easy, or so they thought. When they arrived, the parking lot was packed, and the buzz of excitement filled the air. Families, groups of teenagers, and couples strolled in and out of the trail, towels slung over shoulders and water bottles in hand. The short hike to Punchbowl was scenic, winding through the lush forest and alongside the creek. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the falls. When they finally reached the spot, it was as crowded as the parking lot suggested. About 75 to 100 people were spread out along the rocky shore and in the water. People were jumping off the rocks, laughing, and soaking in the cool water to escape the oppressive heat. My wife and her friends joined in, relishing the brief escape. The water was freezing, a shocking but welcome contrast to the sun beating down on them. They had just gotten out of the water, drying off on the rocks, when someone pointed to a thin ribbon of smoke rising in the distance. At first, no one thought much of it. It was a hot, dry day, and a small wisp of smoke didn't seem alarming. Maybe it was from a distant campfire, or perhaps someone burning something on their property. But within minutes, the smoke thickened. The scent of burning would started to drift in, faint at first, then unmistakable. People began to notice. Conversations quieted, and a sense of unease rippled through the crowd. The smoke grew rapidly. The wispy trail turned into a plume that darkened the sky. Then came the unmistakable sound of a wildfire. A deep, almost guttural roar, like a freight train approaching. The crowd began to stir. A few people decided to leave, heading back toward the trailhead and the safety of their cars. But not long after, some of them came rushing back, panic written all over their faces. "The trail's blocked," one of them shouted. "The fire spread across it. We can't get out that way." The uneasy murmurs turned into outright panic. People were frantically pulling out their phones, trying to call 911. My wife's group joined in, but with so many people in a remote area, the signals were spotty. When someone did get through, the message was grim. The fire was spreading fast, cutting off escape routes. Helicopters were already being dispatched, and responders were trying to figure out what to do with the people trapped by the flames. Minutes later, the first helicopter appeared overhead, the sound of its rotors deafening. A shadow passed over the group as it hovered, dropping bright yellow notes attached to strips of caution tape. People scrambled to grab them, and the message was clear: run. Large fire spreading fast. Head down the trail. But just as quickly as the first message came, a second batch of notes fluttered down. Trail consumed. Stay put. The conflicting instructions left the crowd in chaos. Some people cried, others shouted for calm, but it was clear that no one really knew what to do. The fire was visible now. Flames licking at the trees in the distance, smoke thick enough to make breathing harder. My wife described the moment as pure, unadulterated terror. Suddenly, a woman appeared from deeper in the woods. She was a volunteer with a GPS and a topographical map, and she explained that there was one possible way out. It wasn't a trail, it was rugged, unmarked terrain, but it could lead them to safety if the wind didn't change direction. She quickly outlined the route, her voice steady despite the growing panic around her. People clung to her words like they were a lifeline. With no other options, the group began to move. The first steps were chaotic, with people slipping on the rocks in their flip-flops or barefoot, scrambling to grab what little they had brought with them. My wife's group didn't have much, just their swimsuits, a towel, and a couple of water bottles. The terrain was brutal, steep and uneven, with sharp rocks and dense underbrush. Every step was a struggle, and the heat was unbearable. The smoke made it hard to see, and the air was thick with ash, stinging their eyes and throats. Hours passed. They had no idea if they were going in the right direction. The volunteer stayed at the front, using her GPS to navigate, but the group stretched out over a long distance. People tripped and fell, scraping their knees and hands on the rocky ground. Some cried quietly as they walked, the fear and exhaustion overwhelming. My wife's flip-flops broke early on, and she was forced to continue barefoot. She said the sharp rocks and burning ground were agonizing, but stopping wasn't an option. The fire roared behind them, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The night brought its own set of challenges. The temperature dropped sharply, and the group was completely unprepared for the cold. Swimsuits offered no protection, and people huddled together for warmth whenever they paused to rest. The darkness was disorienting, making the already treacherous terrain even more dangerous. My wife described the sound of the fire at night as haunting, an ever-present roar, punctuated by the crack and crash of trees collapsing under the flames. Despite the fear, something remarkable began to happen. The group started to work together. People shared the little water they had left, helped each other over obstacles, and offered words of encouragement. Strangers became allies, united by a singular goal: survival. After what felt like an eternity, dawn broke. The first rays of sunlight revealed a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. Smoke-filled valleys, scorched trees, and ash-covered ground. But the light also brought hope. They could see their surroundings more clearly, and the volunteer announced that they were nearing a road that would lead them to safety. The final stretch was the hardest. Exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone, and the heat of the day was already returning. But the sight of that road was like a beacon. When they finally emerged from the woods, stumbling onto the asphalt, a wave of relief swept over the group. Emergency responders were waiting, handing out water and blankets, and checking for injuries. All 75 people made it out alive. My wife and her friends were battered, blistered, and emotionally wrecked, but they were safe. The Eagle Creek fire would go on to burn thousands of acres, devastating one side of the Columbia River Valley, but against all odds, they had survived. Even now, years later, the smell of smoke takes my wife back to that day. She can't sit around campfires without feeling a knot of anxiety in her chest. But she's also found strength in the experience. Proof that even in the face of unimaginable fear and hardship, humans are capable of incredible resilience and teamwork. I had been hiking for about 3 hours when the quietness of the trail started to feel unsettling. The trees were thick around me, but the kind of thick that felt oppressive, like they were closing in. I told myself it was just my imagination, that hiking solo in the woods could make anyone feel a little on edge. I had been alone before, but something about this hike felt different, like it was pulling me into something I wasn't supposed to see. At first, I had enjoyed the solitude. The crunch of the leaves beneath my boots was oddly comforting, and the crisp air made me feel alive. But as the path began to narrow, the shadows from the trees started stretching farther than usual. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, but it felt dim, like the forest was too thick to allow the day to truly break through. I came across a campsite after a while. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see a park ranger's inspection or a family enjoying a weekend. No, this spot had been abandoned for some time, and it showed. Broken bottles of alcohol littered the ground, their jagged edges glinting in the filtered light. The smell of stale beer and spilled liquor hit me before I saw it, sharp and sour. The trash was piled up around the site, half-rotted food in tin cans, wrappers scattered across the dirt. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the dry ground. It didn't take a detective to know this wasn't a peaceful retreat. I had hiked these trails often enough to know that people don't leave this much of a mess unless they were in a hurry or something went wrong. The more I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that it was just the sight of the mess, not anything more sinister. I glanced around quickly, hoping for some sign that the people who left this place were nearby, but the forest felt unnaturally still. It was that kind of quiet where you start to wonder if you've disturbed something you shouldn't have. My breath quickened as I pushed the discomfort aside. I had to keep moving. I didn't want to stay in that spot for too long, so I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my gut. I reached a clearing where the trail narrowed again, and in the distance, I could see the edge of the canyon. The view was breathtaking, mountains stretching out to the horizon, and the canyon floor far below. It was exactly what I'd hoped to find when I set out on the hike. But as I walked closer to the edge of the trail, the air shifted. Something smelled terrible, like decay, rotten meat, and something metallic. It hit me out of nowhere, sharp and rank. I paused instinctively, my body tensing as the familiar smell twisted its way into my lungs. I had been hiking long enough to know that the woods can smell bad sometimes, especially after rain or in places where animals have died. But this was different. This was wrong. I peered over the edge, hoping to see nothing more than the usual brush and dirt below. What I saw instead froze me in place. Just a few feet away, sticking out from a rolled-up tarp, were two bloated dog heads. I stared at them for a moment, my brain refusing to process what it was seeing. The heads were bloated and distorted, their eyes sunken and swollen. Their mouths were partially open, as if they had been left to rot for days. The smell hit me again, overpowering and nauseating. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what I was seeing. The heads were too fresh to be from a natural death, and the tarp, it wasn't just a stray covering. It had been deliberately rolled, like someone had taken care to hide whatever was underneath. I couldn't bring myself to move any closer. I was paralyzed by a sense of dread, a feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't figure out exactly what. For a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The hairs on my neck stood on end, my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from those dog heads. How could someone do something like this? It didn't feel like an accident. It didn't feel like something that had just happened. It felt intentional. I took another step back, my mind whirling as the reality of what I had just seen started to sink in. I had no idea if there was more under that tarp. It was too big to just be the two heads. I could barely focus enough to think clearly. Was this a sick joke? Was this some kind of twisted warning? I turned, my body moving before I even fully processed the decision. My legs carried me quickly back down the trail, my heart hammering in my chest as I sprinted. Every crunch of my boots felt like a loud echo in the silent woods, but I didn't dare stop. I didn't dare slow down. My thoughts raced as I pushed myself harder, desperate to get back to my car, back to the safety of the open road. What kind of people would do something like that? What did it mean? The thought of being out there alone on that trail with whoever had left that tarp behind. It was too much. The forest seemed endless as I ran, but eventually, I spotted the clearing where I had parked my car. My breath was ragged, my chest tight with the exertion of my run. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking as I unlocked the door and scrambled inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly, and sat there for a moment, my heart still racing. I knew I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't just forget what I had seen. I pulled out my phone and dialed the Forest Service. My hands were still shaking, my voice shaky as I explained what I had found. The dogs, the tarp, everything. The woman on the other end listened calmly, taking down all the details. She assured me they'd send someone out as soon as possible. But as I sat there, waiting for some sense of reassurance, I couldn't shake the image of those dog heads from my mind. I kept thinking about how they had been left there, exposed. No attempt to bury them, no sign of any kind of remorse. Just abandoned. I thought about the people who had done it. Drunk or worse, people who saw nothing wrong with ending lives for their own twisted reasons. It wasn't until I pulled out of the parking lot, heading home, that I finally started to calm down. The adrenaline was wearing off, but my mind was still racing. Who had done this? Why had they done it? What else might they have left behind? In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The Forest Service never called me back, and I never heard any news about what happened to those dogs, or whether they found anything else. But I knew one thing for sure. Someone had done something cruel out there. Whether it was a twisted prank, a dog-fighting ring, or something worse, I couldn't say. But I knew that trail would never feel the same again. Every time I go hiking now, I can't help but think about the things that might be hiding just off the trail, waiting for someone to stumble across them. And I'll never forget that smell. The smell of death, of something that had been abandoned and forgotten. It's a smell I'll carry with me every time I step into the woods. I learned a lot that day, not just about the people who might lurk in the forest, but about the darker parts of the world I didn't want to see. And in a way, I think it's good that I found it. Because sometimes, the world needs people who are willing to report what's wrong, even if they don't want to face it. I never went back to that trail. Maybe someday someone else will. But for me, that place will always be a reminder of how far some people are willing to go, and just how fragile our sense of safety really is. A few years ago, I joined a local hiking group. I'd always been into the outdoors. There's something about the stillness of the woods, the scent of pine, and the sound of rushing water that made me feel alive. The group was small and friendly, and on this particular trip, we had a new guy join us. His name was Matt. He seemed like a solid guy, the kind of person who'd been around nature long enough to respect it. We talked a little on the way up the trail, and I could tell he was fit and confident, maybe a little too confident. The hike was a tough one, leading to a waterfall tucked deep in the mountains. It was spring, and the snowmelt made the streams and falls stronger than usual. The trail snaked through dense forest, crossing slippery rocks and patches of loose dirt. Despite the challenges, the group moved steadily. I remember how humid it felt, the way sweat clung to my back, and how the air carried the faint smell of damp earth and moss. When we reached the waterfall, it was breathtaking. Cascading water crashing into a pool below, surrounded by jagged rocks and overhanging trees. It wasn't huge, maybe 40 feet tall, but the water's roar filled the air. The ground near the base was slick with spray, the rocks dark and glistening. We stopped to rest and take in the view, sitting on nearby logs and boulders. Matt, however, wasn't one to sit still. He started climbing up the side of the waterfall. At first, it seemed harmless. He was agile, moving quickly from rock to rock. The group called out a few warnings, but Matt just waved us off with a grin. He was clearly enjoying himself, his excitement almost contagious. But as he got higher, I started feeling uneasy. The rocks near the top were covered in moss and slick from the mist. I could see pine needles scattered across the ledge he was heading toward. It was the kind of terrain that looked stable until you put weight on it. "Be careful," someone shouted, but Matt didn't respond. He reached the top, standing triumphantly on the edge, arms outstretched like he'd conquered the world. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at us and the view around him. Then it happened. I saw his foot slide on the pine needles. He tried to catch himself, arms flailing, but there was nothing to grab onto. The world seemed to slow as he fell, his body twisting midair. The sound of his scream was drowned out by the waterfall's roar. The impact was sickening. He landed on the rocks below with a heavy thud that echoed in the valley. For a moment, no one moved. It was like time froze. Then, someone yelled, and we all rushed toward him. I was the first one to reach him. The image is burned into my memory. Blood was pouring from a gash on his head, soaking his hair and pooling on the rocks. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone piercing through the skin. His spine looked wrong, twisted in a way that didn't seem possible. And his mouth. He'd bitten through the area below his lips, creating a gaping wound that looked like a second mouth. I froze for a second, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Then adrenaline kicked in. I dropped my backpack and scrambled to find anything I could use to help. I grabbed a clean shirt and pressed it to the wound on his head, trying to slow the bleeding. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it in place. Matt was still alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and uneven, a horrible rattling sound with every exhale. His eyes were half open, unfocused, and blood was bubbling from his mouth. I kept talking to him, though I don't know if he could hear me. The rest of the group arrived, their faces pale and horrified. Someone called 911, their voice trembling as they explained our location. We were deep in the valley, miles from any road, and the dispatcher said it would take at least an hour for medics to reach us. That hour felt like an eternity. Every second was filled with the sound of Matt's labored breathing and the frantic murmurs of the group. I tried to keep pressure on his head wound, but the blood just kept coming. My hands were slick with it, the warm, sticky feeling making my stomach churn. We used jackets and backpacks to stabilize him as best as we could, trying not to move his spine. Someone tore up a shirt to create a makeshift tourniquet for his leg, but the sight of the bone sticking out made me feel lightheaded. I remember focusing on small details to keep myself from panicking. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the pattern of the blood on the rocks, the smell of iron mixed with the forest air. When the medics finally arrived, it was both a relief and a new kind of horror. They worked quickly, assessing Matt's injuries and setting up the ropes needed to lift him out of the valley. Watching them handle his broken body was hard to stomach. They strapped him to a backboard, stabilizing his neck and spine, and hooked him up to oxygen. It took another 2 hours to get him to the helicopter. The terrain was steep and uneven, and the medics had to navigate carefully to avoid further injuring him. The rest of us watched helplessly, unable to do anything but wait. By the time the helicopter lifted off, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. The hike back to the trailhead was silent. No one spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop replaying the fall in my mind, the sound of his body hitting the rocks, the sight of his blood on my hands. For weeks after the accident, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Matt's broken body and heard his ragged breaths. I questioned everything. Could I have done more to help? Should we have stopped him from climbing? The guilt and trauma were overwhelming. But then, something incredible happened. Against all odds, Matt survived. His injuries were catastrophic. Multiple fractures, a punctured lung, severe blood loss, but he pulled through. The doctors were amazed. They said it was a miracle he even made it to the hospital alive, let alone recovered. Over the next few months, Matt underwent multiple surgeries and grueling physical therapy. Slowly but surely, he regained movement. I visited him a few times during his recovery, and each time I was struck by his resilience. Despite everything, he remained optimistic, determined to walk again. And he did. By the following year, Matt was back on the trails, moving a little slower but just as passionate about the outdoors. Seeing him hike again felt surreal, like the nightmare of that day had been rewritten. It didn't erase the trauma, but it reminded me of the strength of the human spirit. That experience changed me forever. It taught me how fragile life is, how quickly things can go wrong, and how important it is to stay prepared. I still hike, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the risks. Matt's recovery was nothing short of a miracle, but the memories of that day will always stay with me. It was the most traumatic event of my life, but also a testament to resilience and the power of hope. Sometimes, when I'm out on the trail and the sunlight filters through the trees just right, I think of Matt standing on top of that waterfall, full of life and energy, and I remind myself to never take a single moment for granted. It was years ago, back when hiking trips with my dad were a regular thing. I was younger then, more full of energy, and those weekend hikes were our way of bonding. We'd pick trails in places that felt remote, quiet, and untouched, and this time we chose a narrow, winding trail deep in the hills of West Virginia. It was the kind of place where you didn't see another soul for hours. The dirt paths snaked through dense forests. The air smelled like earth and moss, and the occasional chirping of birds was the only sound apart from our footsteps. The trees loomed high, their branches intertwined like a natural canopy, blocking out much of the sunlight and leaving the trail bathed in a dim, greenish glow. We had been hiking for most of the afternoon, moving at a steady pace but not rushing. Dad was in the lead, as always, his old hiking boots crunching against the gravel. I carried the smaller pack, filled with snacks, water, and a basic first aid kit, while he hauled the heavier one with extra gear. The trail had started to narrow, and the forest around us grew denser, the air a bit cooler as the sun began its descent. Then we heard it, a sound out of place in the wilderness, the low rumble of a car engine somewhere up ahead. It was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the natural silence of the woods. We both paused, exchanging a quick glance. Hearing a vehicle this deep into the trail wasn't entirely unheard of. Some roads crisscrossed these hills, but it was unexpected. Curiosity got the better of us, so we pressed on, following the noise. The path dipped into a small valley and then climbed again, leading us to the top of a hill. As we crested it, the scene below came into view. There was a pickup truck, an older model, parked at an awkward angle on the narrow dirt road that ran parallel to the hiking trail. The back of the truck was smashed in, a tree trunk lying across it like some giant had swatted it down in frustration. The engine was still running, sputtering and coughing as if protesting the abuse it had just endured. As we got closer, we saw a man standing beside the truck. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his face red with exertion and frustration. His hands were on his hips as he stared at the wreckage like he couldn't quite believe what had happened. We approached cautiously, our footsteps crunching on the gravel of the road. Dad was always friendly but cautious when meeting strangers in places like this. It wasn't paranoia, just a sense of being aware. Out here, miles from any real help, you couldn't afford to assume too much. "What happened?" Dad asked, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the quiet air. The man turned to us, wiping sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. "Truck started sliding off the road," he said, gesturing to the soft shoulder of the dirt path. "I thought I'd try to pull it back up." He motioned to a bungee cord, now lying limp and tangled near the truck's rear bumper. "Hooked that thing up to the tree, gunned the engine. Figured it'd pull me back onto the road. Damn thing snapped, though, and the tree came right down." I glanced at the tree. It was massive, and the way it had fallen made it clear just how much force had been at play. The bungee cord idea sounded like something out of a cartoon, and I had to suppress a snort. Dad, ever the diplomat, just nodded, though I could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The man seemed to sense our thoughts because he added defensively, "It seemed like a good idea at the time." We stood there for a moment, the three of us, taking in the scene. The truck was thoroughly stuck, the tree pinning it down and blocking most of the road. There wasn't much we could do to help, and the man didn't ask us to. He seemed more embarrassed than anything else. After a bit, Dad asked him if we were still on the right path to get back to the parking lot where we'd started. The man scratched his head, looking a little confused. "If you keep going, you'll get to the amusement park," he said. "There's a parking area there." Amusement park? That didn't sound right. We hadn't seen or heard anything about an amusement park nearby when we planned this hike. Dad thanked him anyway, and we moved on, leaving the man to deal with his truck and the fallen tree. As we walked, we talked about what he might have meant. Amusement park? Out here? It didn't make sense. The trail continued to wind through the woods, and soon the sound of the truck faded behind us. The forest closed in again, quiet and still. It wasn't until another hour later that we figured out what he had been talking about. The trail ended abruptly at a clearing, and there, perched on a small hill, was a weathered old building with a sign out front. It read, Civil War Museum and Historical Park. The amusement park he mentioned was actually this museum. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but it did have a small parking lot nearby, and that was enough for us. We laughed about it, the absurdity of the misunderstanding lightening the mood. As we made our way back to our car, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The encounter with the man and his truck stuck with me, though. It was a strange moment, a reminder of how unpredictable and odd things could get out here in the middle of nowhere. Years later, I still think about that hike, not because anything terrifying happened, but because of the odd mix of tension and humor, the unexpectedness of it all. It wasn't the kind of story you'd tell around a campfire to spook people, but it stayed with me nonetheless. A strange little slice of life out in the woods of West Virginia. It was supposed to be a perfect solo hike, 15 miles deep into an alpine wilderness, where the world felt untouched, raw, and far away from anything resembling civilization. I'd spent weeks planning it, preparing meticulously. The trail I'd chosen was long and grueling, but that's what drew me to it. The isolation, the challenge, the peace of being so utterly alone. By the time I reached my intended camping spot, a small clearing near a glacial lake surrounded by jagged peaks, the sun was dipping low. The sharp, cold air stung my lungs in a way that reminded me how far I was from the comforts of home. I set up my tent, boiled some water for dinner, and watched the light fade as the stars began to bloom. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no planes overhead, just the occasional breeze through the pines and the faint trickle of water from a nearby stream. After a long day of hiking, exhaustion hit me hard. I laid down in my tent, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears as I began to drift off. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze. Out here, 15 miles from the trailhead, I hadn't seen a soul all day. My first thought was a bear, but the steps were too deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving with purpose. My heart pounded as I sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. A man stepped into the faint glow of my campfire. He was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing shorts and a t-shirt with no pack, no visible gear, nothing to suggest he belonged out here. His face was gaunt, his movements unsteady. The first thing he said, in a voice that cracked with exhaustion, was, "Do you have any water?" I grabbed my water bottle and handed it to him without a second thought. He took it with trembling hands and drank greedily, spilling some down his chin. As he handed it back, he muttered, almost to himself, "Been hiking since yesterday." I nodded, trying to process the situation. "Where's your gear?" I asked. "Didn't have any. My buddy and we went off trail, skirted some cliffs. It got bad." He trailed off, staring at the ground, his expression hollow. Then, half laughing, half in a monotone, he said, "Yeah, his brains are everywhere." I forced a laugh, unsure of how else to respond, but every instinct I had screamed that something was off. Not that he was dangerous. There was no malice in him, but something about the way he spoke, the vacant look in his eyes, made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard and asked, "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his lips trembling. I could tell he was trying to keep himself together, but the weight of whatever had happened was too much. "He slipped," he said finally. "We were up on the ridge and he lost his footing. When he hit his head, it just popped. I climbed down to him, but he was wedged in this crevasse. Couldn't get him out. Spent all day trying. Then I had to hike out to find help." I stared at him, the reality of what he was saying sinking in. He wasn't making it up. Every word was coated in raw, unfiltered shock. His hands were shredded, his legs torn up and caked with dried blood. He'd clearly been through hell. "You need to sit down," I said, gesturing to a log near the fire. He shook his head. "If I sit, I'll lose my legs." "You've got to rest," I insisted, pulling out some food and a cigarette from my bag. "Eat something. Smoke this. You need it." Reluctantly, he lowered himself onto the log, wincing as his legs buckled beneath him. He took the cigarette with trembling fingers and lit it, the glow of the ember casting eerie shadows on his face. I handed him a granola bar, and he ate it in small, deliberate bites, as if his body wasn't sure how to process food anymore. After a few minutes, he looked up at me, his eyes desperate. "You've got to come with me," he said. "Help me get him out." I hesitated, the weight of his request sinking in. I wasn't equipped for something like that. I didn't have the training or the tools. And even if I did, the thought of navigating off-trail cliffs in the dark was suicidal. "Hold on," I said. "I've got a phone. Let's see if I can get a signal." He stared at me blankly, as if he didn't believe me. But somehow, miraculously, my phone picked up a single bar of service. I dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. The operator assured me they'd dispatch a rescue team immediately, and I relayed our location as best I could. "They're on their way," I told him. "We just have to wait." He didn't seem to register my words. He stood abruptly, his body swaying, and started toward the bush. "I have to go back," he mumbled. "I can't leave him out there." I grabbed his arm gently but firmly. "Hey," I said, my voice calm but commanding. "You're not going anywhere. Sit down. They're coming to help." For a moment, he resisted, his body tensing as if he might bolt. But then he crumpled back onto the log, his head in his hands. "I can't just leave him," he whispered. Hours later, the first rescue team arrived. They were like something out of a movie, fit, focused, and completely unfazed by the treacherous terrain. They spoke with the man briefly, gathering details about his friend's location, before setting off into the night. Over the next few hours, more volunteers arrived, each one looking more prepared than the last. I stayed behind at my camp, doing what little I could to support the rescue effort. I offered water, food, and a place to rest for the volunteers as they came and went. The man, exhausted beyond words, eventually curled up near the fire and fell into a fitful sleep. The rescue team spent 6 days up there in whiteout conditions, keeping a constant vigil over the body. When the weather finally broke, a helicopter flew in to retrieve them and the remains of the man's friend. I stayed at my camp until they were gone, the weight of what had happened pressing heavily on my chest. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't stop thinking about the sheer selflessness of those rescue workers. They risked their lives for a stranger, not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. It made me realize how small and fragile we are out here, how easily things can go wrong. Hiking isn't just a hobby. It's a reminder of our vulnerability, our connection to the raw, indifferent power of nature. That trip changed me. It wasn't the isolation or the challenge that stuck with me. It was the humanity, the quiet heroism of those who answered the call. I'll never forget their faces, their determination, or the man who stumbled into my camp, broken and lost but alive. The trail had always been my escape, a place where the chaos of life faded, and I could lose myself in the rhythm of my boots hitting the ground. I'd been hiking for over 11 years and had experienced plenty of challenging trails, but I'd never encountered anything I'd call crazy. Sure, there were close calls with weather or steep cliffs, but nothing that stuck with me beyond a day or two. That changed last year on a trail that had been ravaged by a recent storm. The plan was straightforward: a challenging but rewarding hike to a summit where my group and I would camp for the night. There were 3 of us, all seasoned hikers who knew how to handle ourselves in the wilderness. The storm that hit a week prior had left the trail in shambles. Fallen trees crisscrossed the path, mudslides had obliterated sections of it, and some markers were missing altogether. Still, we'd done our homework, brought a map, and relied on GPS as backup. Even with the obstacles, we made decent time. We reached the summit around 5:30 p.m., just as the light was beginning to shift. The view was stunning. Clouds hung low in the valleys below us, and the golden hue of the sun made the rough climb worthwhile. It felt like we were alone in the world, surrounded only by the quiet wilderness. By 6 p.m., we had our tents set up, and the air was cooling rapidly. We were in the middle of discussing dinner plans when we noticed a man approaching from a separate trail that connected to ours near the summit. It wasn't unusual to see other hikers, but something about him immediately felt off. He moved quickly but without the rhythm of an experienced hiker. His clothes were functional but not suited for an overnight trip. Light pants, a simple jacket, and a small day pack that didn't seem to hold much. He greeted us with a nod, and we exchanged polite hellos. He mentioned he was day hiking and intended to finish the loop trail that night. That's when the red flags started piling up in my mind. The nearest hut or road was 16 miles away, and the sun was already setting. He had no flashlight, and the trail was barely passable in daylight, let alone in darkness. I couldn't help but speak up. I told him the trail ahead was in bad shape, especially after the storm, and that he might want to reconsider his plan. My friend backed me up, pointing out that without a light, it would be nearly impossible to navigate the trail safely. The man smiled, thanked us for the advice, and assured us he'd be fine. It was such a casual dismissal of what felt like obvious dangers that it left me uneasy. We had a spare headlamp, so I insisted he take it. He hesitated for a moment before accepting it with a quick thanks and continuing on his way. We watched him disappear down the trail, his pace steady and determined. The encounter left us all a little shaken. None of us could understand why he'd choose to press on under such risky conditions. Night fell, and we tried to put the encounter out of our minds. We ate dinner, shared stories, and crawled into our tents as the stars spread across the sky. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every now and then, I'd imagine hearing something. A twig snapping, the faint rustle of leaves. But each time I told myself it was just the wind or a small animal. Morning came quietly. The forest bathed in a soft light as we broke camp. My thoughts immediately went to the man from the previous evening. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. Curious, we checked the trail he had taken. Sure enough, his footprints were there, heading deeper into the damaged path. He hadn't turned around. The hike back down was uneventful, but the man stayed on my mind. As we approached the nearest hut, an obvious checkpoint on the trail, we decided to ask the staff if they'd seen him. The hut was small but well-staffed, with rangers and volunteers who kept track of hikers in the area. If the man had passed through, they would know. Inside, we described him to the workers. His clothes, his lack of gear, and the direction he was headed. They exchanged puzzled looks and shook their heads. No one matching that description had come through. It was unsettling, to say the least. The trail he'd taken led directly to the hut. There were no alternate routes, no shortcuts he could have taken. If he'd made it, they would have seen him. But there was no record of him signing in, no report of anyone fitting his description passing by. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd found another way out or met up with someone who gave him a ride. Maybe he was faster than we thought and had passed through before the staff came on duty. But the timing didn't make sense. Even if he'd moved quickly, he would have had to travel through the night to beat us to the hut. We finished our hike in relative silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. In the days that followed, I kept an eye on local news, expecting to hear about a missing hiker or an accident on the trail. but nothing came up. No one reported anything unusual, and there were no alerts or rescue operations. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Even now, I can't explain it. I tell myself he must have been fine, that he knew the trail better than we did or had some plan we weren't aware of. But there's a part of me that can't shake the unease I felt that evening. It wasn't just his lack of preparation or the danger of the trail. It was his calm confidence in the face of what seemed like insurmountable odds. Hiking has always been a source of peace for me, but that encounter left me with a new respect for the unpredictability of the wilderness and the people you meet in it. Some questions don't have answers, and maybe that's part of what makes the trail so compelling. It challenges you not just physically, but mentally, leaving you to grapple with the things you can't quite explain. The summer air was dry and sharp, a mix of the desert heat and the faint scent of earth and wild sage. 2 decades ago, I was on a donkey tour in the Grand Canyon, something I'd been excited about for months. The idea of riding through the winding paths of one of the world's most iconic natural landmarks felt like an adventure I couldn't pass up. The donkeys, sturdy and sure-footed, carried us along steep trails carved into the reddish-brown cliffs, their hooves clicking against the stone. The tour guide at the front was a wiry man with a sun-creased face. His voice carried on the wind, explaining the history and geology of the canyon. Behind him, a group of about 15 of us followed, each perched on our donkeys. Some people chatted quietly, but most, like me, were absorbed in the overwhelming scale of the canyon. The vastness of it was humbling. Jagged cliffs stretched out in layers, their colors shifting with the sunlight. Far below, the Colorado River snaked through the canyon floor, a thin thread of shimmering green. I was somewhere in the middle of the line, my donkey plodding along at its own pace. Ahead of me, an older woman, probably in her late 60s or early 70s, rode on a gray donkey. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, a faded blue shirt, and hiking boots that looked well-worn. Her back was slightly hunched, and she held the reins loosely, as if she were completely at ease. I remember noticing how calm she seemed, even as the trail narrowed in some places and the drop-off to our left became steeper. The path at this point was still wide enough to feel safe. There was plenty of room for the donkeys to pass without getting too close to the edge. The guide had assured us at the start that the animals were incredibly reliable, trained to handle the terrain with precision. But still, I couldn't shake a faint undercurrent of unease as I glanced at the canyon's edge. We were approaching a section of the trail that inclined slightly, the kind that makes your legs feel the strain even when you're just walking. The woman in front of me began to catch my attention for reasons I couldn't quite place at first. She was swaying a little in her saddle, side to side, her movements slight but noticeable. I assumed she was adjusting her position, maybe stretching to ease a cramp. But then the swaying became more pronounced. Her body tilted left, then right, as though she couldn't find her balance. It happened so gradually that it didn't immediately register as alarming. The donkey beneath her seemed to notice something was off, its steps becoming hesitant. The woman's swaying grew worse, her upper body slumping forward. For a split second, I thought she might be trying to dismount or shift her weight, but the movements were too uncontrolled. And then, in what felt like slow motion, she tipped sharply to the left. Her grip on the reins loosened, and her body slid sideways. The donkey, startled, jerked its head, and the motion pulled her even further off balance. She slumped completely to the side, dragging the donkey with her. Before I could even process what was happening, they both went over the edge. It was like watching a nightmare unfold. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. My heart stopped as I saw them tumble over the side. The woman didn't scream. There was no sound except for the faint scrape of hooves on rock and the rustling of disturbed dirt and pebbles falling into the abyss. I stared at the empty spot where they'd been, my mind refusing to accept what I'd just seen. The drop-off was steep, easily over 100 feet, and I couldn't imagine any outcome that didn't end in tragedy. My breath caught in my throat as the reality of it sank in. The guide at the front must have heard or sensed something because he turned sharply and leapt off his donkey. He sprinted back toward us, his boots skidding on the rocky trail. When he reached the spot where the woman had fallen, he froze, staring down over the edge. For a moment, he didn't move, and then he let out a sound I'll never forget. A guttural, horrified scream that echoed against the canyon walls. It was a raw, unfiltered reaction, one that sent a chill through everyone in the group. A few people began to dismount, their faces pale and stricken, but the guide quickly raised his hands, motioning for them to stop. "Stay back," he barked, his voice hoarse. Another guide, who'd been bringing up the rear, came forward, her expression grim. She and the first guide exchanged a brief, urgent conversation in low tones before she pulled out a radio and started speaking into it. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her tone was clipped and serious. The rest of us sat in stunned silence, still on our donkeys. No one said a word. The air felt heavier, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. I couldn't bring myself to look over the edge, even though a part of me wanted to. The image of her falling, of the donkey tumbling after her, was seared into my mind. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The guides kept us moving, insisting we stay together and not linger at the scene. The rest of the ride was a blur. The sun seemed harsher, the canyon less beautiful, as if the tragedy had tainted everything around us. When we finally returned to the base camp, the mood was somber. Some of the other riders tried to ask the guides what would happen next, but they didn't offer much information. There would be an investigation, they said, and the proper authorities had been notified. That was all. I never found out what became of the woman or the donkey. There was no follow-up, no news article or report that I could find later. All I had was the memory, vivid and unrelenting, of that moment on the trail. To this day, I can't visit the Grand Canyon without thinking of her. The vastness of the canyon, its beauty and danger, feels different now. It's a place that reminds me of how fragile we are, how quickly things can change. It's a reminder that some questions will never have answers, and some memories will never fade.